Close your eyes for a moment and imagine it's a Friday night somewhere in America, sometime in the 1970s. The parking lot outside is packed with station wagons and muscle cars. Through the front doors, you can hear it before you even step inside, the low thunder of polyurethane wheels on hardwood, a disco song bouncing off the walls, the laughter of 100 people all moving in the same direction at the same time. The air smells like popcorn and floor wax and something electric, something alive. This is the roller rink. And for a few decades, it was one of the most purely joyful places in American life. So how did it disappear? That's what we're going to explore today, the full arc of roller skating in America. From its surprisingly old origins, through its stunning golden age, all the way to the quiet, heartbreaking fade-out that left darkened rinks standing empty in towns all across the country. Because this isn't just a story about skates and disco balls. It's a story about how Americans spent their leisure time, how culture shifts, how communities gather and then drift apart, and what gets left behind when something beloved dies a slow and unspectacular death. Let's go back to the beginning, because roller skating is much older than most people realize. The first recorded roller skate was invented in the mid-1700s by a Belgian musician named John Joseph Merlin, who, in one of the more memorable entrances in history, famously rolled into a masquerade party in London wearing his invention while playing a violin. He had no way to steer and no way to stop, and he crashed directly into a large and expensive mirror. A dramatic debut, to say the least. Early skates were clunky, unpredictable things, and it took another century of tinkering before someone figured out the key design breakthrough that made skating practical for regular people. That breakthrough came in 1863, when an American inventor named James Leonard Plimpton introduced the quad skate, 4 wheels arranged in a rectangular pattern, 2 in front and 2 in back. Plimpton's design added a rubber cushion that allowed the skater to lean and steer, and suddenly, for the first time, skating was something an ordinary person could actually control. Plimpton opened a skating parlor in Newport, Rhode Island, and the craze caught on fast. By the 1880s, roller rinks were popping up in cities and towns across the United States and Europe. Victorian-era Americans, who didn't have a lot of sanctioned ways to socialize across gender lines, found the roller rink to be one of the few places where men and women could mix freely, holding hands while skating together without raising too many eyebrows. The rink was socially progressive in that quiet, practical way that only leisure spaces can be. The craze came and went in waves over the following decades. Skating boomed, cooled off, boomed again. By the early 20th century it had settled into a respectable but unremarkable place in American recreation. It was a thing you did occasionally, not something that defined a generation. That would come later. The real transformation, the moment roller skating became woven into the fabric of American culture, happened in 2 distinct phases during the 20th century, and both of them were powered by something skating alone couldn't have generated on its own: music. The first phase came in the postwar era of the late 1940s and 1950s. America was building suburbs at a staggering pace, young families were moving out of cities, and the question of what to do with all that new leisure time, all those Saturday afternoons and summer evenings, was being answered by entrepreneurs who built rinks in those very same suburbs. The rink became a fixture of small-town and middle-class American life. It was wholesome, it was affordable, and it was endlessly repeatable. You could go every weekend and it never got old. Rinks hired organists, live organists, who would play from elevated booths above the skating floor, shifting tempos to speed skaters up or slow them down, calling out couples skates and backward skates and the limbo. The rink had its own language, its own rituals, its own culture. And for a generation of American kids growing up in the 1950s and early 1960s, it was simply where you went. But then came the second phase, and this one was something else entirely. This was the golden age that anyone who grew up in the 1970s or early 1980s will remember with something close to reverence. Disco changed everything. When the discotheque sound exploded out of New York City in the early to mid-1970s, that pulsing, 4-on-the-floor beat, that sense of forward motion built into the music itself, roller rink owners recognized almost immediately that it was the perfect soundtrack for what they were already doing. Skating and disco were made for each other in a way that felt almost cosmically inevitable. The music drove you forward. The rhythm told your body exactly what to do. You didn't skate to disco. You skated with it. Rinks updated their sound systems, installed mirror balls, put in colored lighting rigs. The organ was retired, or at least moved to weekend afternoons for the nostalgic crowd, and in its place came a DJ booth and speakers loud enough to feel in your chest. The atmosphere changed completely. The rink stopped being a quaint community fixture and became something genuinely cool, genuinely exciting, a place where teenagers wanted to be seen. Skating apparel became fashion. Skates became status symbols, sleek leather boots with bright wheels and candy colors. People practiced tricks, built skills, developed styles. Couple skates became charged with romantic possibility in a way the old organ and organdy nights had never quite managed. And critically, the roller rink of the disco era was racially integrated in a way that a lot of American public spaces still weren't. Skating had always had a complicated racial history. Many rinks in the South and parts of the North had been segregated for decades, running designated colored nights or outright excluding black patrons. The disco era, with its roots in black and Latino music culture, helped shift that dynamic. Rinks became melting pots, at least in the better and more enlightened corners of American life, and the culture that grew up inside them reflected that richness. The music, the style, the moves, all of it was cross-cultural in a way that felt genuinely new. This was also the era of the great roller disco phenomenon, where the worlds of the rink and the nightclub briefly became the same world. In 1979, the film Roller Boogie came out, and the sport was being covered in mainstream magazines and newspapers. Celebrities were photographed on skates. There was a genuine, breathless sense that roller skating was not a fad but a permanent elevation, that it had arrived as a serious American pastime the way jogging or tennis had arrived in the same decade. But here is the thing about golden ages. They're always golden in retrospect, which means you don't always notice while you're living inside one that the peak has already passed. The transition was not sudden. It didn't happen with a single cultural event or a bad business decision. It was a slow leak, a gradual pressure change, the kind of decline that's only obvious when you look back from a distance of 20 or 30 years. The first blow was the death of disco itself. By 1980, the backlash against disco culture had become one of the stranger cultural phenomena in American history, a visceral, sometimes ugly rejection of everything the genre represented. Radio stations stopped playing it. The term itself became a punchline. And while the music that replaced it, early MTV rock, new wave, and eventually the synth-heavy pop of the mid-80s, was perfectly capable of being played in a rink, something about the specific symbiosis between disco and skating didn't transfer. The magic had been in the particular combination, and when one half of it was removed, the spell broke. Then came the next wave of competition for American leisure time, and this one was permanent. The video game arcade arrived in force in the late 1970s and absolutely dominated the early 1980s. Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, Galaga, the arcade pulled teenagers away from the rink with the irresistible gravity of something genuinely new. And a few years later, the home video game console and then the VCR and the home video rental market pulled them even further inward, toward the couch, toward private experience rather than communal experience. The rink asked you to go somewhere, put on rented skates, be sweaty in public and occasionally fall down in front of people. The couch asked nothing of you at all. Through the mid-1980s, rinks tried to adapt. They added video arcade rooms. They hosted birthday parties aggressively. They brought in new music and new events. Inline skates, rollerblades, created a brief second surge of interest in the early 1990s, but inline skating was mostly an outdoor activity, and it never drove the rink business the way quad skating had. Rinks sat somewhere between nostalgic and dated, not quite either, and that ambiguity made them hard to market. The economics were always brutal. A roller rink is an enormous physical space, you need that floor, you need that square footage, and real estate costs money. Heating it, cooling it, maintaining the floor, paying staff, replacing equipment, covering insurance, the overhead was relentless. In the fat years of the late 1970s, a popular rink in a mid-size American city could do several thousand skaters in a weekend and the business made obvious sense. But as attendance dropped through the 1980s and 1990s, the math got harder and harder to make work. The building didn't get smaller when fewer people came. The bills didn't shrink. Rinks that had been printing money were suddenly struggling to break even, and many didn't survive. There are no perfect national statistics on exactly how many rinks closed and when, but the numbers that do exist are striking. At the peak in the late 1970s and early 1980s, there were estimated to be around 4,000 operating roller rinks in the United States. By the early 2000s, that number had dropped to somewhere around 2,000. By the 2020s, estimates put the surviving count at fewer than 500. 3,500 places, gone. The closures were rarely dramatic. That's part of what makes this story feel so melancholy. There was no single villain, no catastrophic event, no moment of reckoning. A rink would cut its hours, then cut them again. It would stop hosting weeknight skates, then stop hosting Saturday nights, then start renting the floor for private parties because private parties could be guaranteed revenue in a way that open skating nights couldn't. And then one day the sign would come down, and the building would be sold to become a church, or a furniture warehouse, or a Planet Fitness, and the floor, that gorgeous hardwood floor worn smooth by 100,000 pairs of wheels over 30 years, would be ripped out and carted away. What replaced roller skating in American leisure? Everything and nothing. The fragmenting of entertainment, the internet, streaming video, smartphones, the infinite scroll of content that demands nothing of your body, pulled people away from all communal leisure activities, not just skating. Bowling alleys faced the same pressure. Movie theaters faced it. The roller rink was just more vulnerable than some of the others because its core audience, teenagers and young adults, was exactly the demographic most thoroughly captured by digital culture. There is also something worth sitting with about what the roller rink represented that has become genuinely harder to find. It was a place that required your physical presence and rewarded your effort. You had to learn to do it. You got better over time. It was social in an embodied way. You were in the same room, breathing the same air, moving in the same circle, occasionally reaching out to help a stranger who was about to fall. It created a kind of low-stakes shared vulnerability that's actually quite rare. Everyone at the rink, from the seasoned speed skater to the terrified 7-year-old clinging to the wall, was risking something small and real. That shared exposure, that collective willingness to look slightly ridiculous in public, built something. It built community in the old-fashioned sense, and yet, there's a counter-narrative worth mentioning here, because the obituary for roller skating has been written several times and the patient keeps surprising everyone. The handful of rinks that survived into the 2010s and 2020s are, in many cases, thriving. They've become something between a genuine community institution and a retro experience, and both of those things have real value in the current cultural moment. When the pandemic lockdowns ended and people emerged desperate for physical, communal, joyful activity, skating surged. Rink attendance climbed. A new generation discovered the appeal, the music, the movement, the strange and lovely democracy of everyone going in circles together. Outdoor skating communities have grown in cities. Roller derby, which had its own resurgence in the 2000s, brought a new generation of women and non-binary athletes into quad skating with a ferocity and athleticism that would have bewildered the organist at your grandmother's Friday night skate. And on social media, of all places, skating videos racked up millions of views, people watching with a hunger that suggested they wanted something more than passive consumption, that somewhere underneath the scroll there was a body that wanted to move, to be in motion, to feel the floor rolling beneath its feet. The roller rink was never just a building. It was an idea about what leisure could be: communal, physical, musical, democratic, a little bit daring. The buildings mostly disappeared because the economics were impossible and the cultural moment shifted. But the idea, it turns out, is harder to kill than a hardwood floor. It went underground, it went quiet, and then one day it rolled back out, wearing new wheels, playing a new song, asking if you wanted to join the circle. Maybe you should.